Oh, welcome to our second panel for this afternoon. We have four invitees, and we're happy to have all of you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for accepting the invitation on behalf of the Luso American Education Foundation, but certainly on behalf of PBBI. Thank you very much for your participation. The panel is basically the community and democratic values or values of democracy, more than it's not any way, shape or form partisan or political in that aspect, although everything in life is political, from getting up in the morning to getting dressed to getting the colors to for example, Dr. Linda Carvalho Cooley's being very political there with the hortensias, So I mean, all of the, and very island political, by the way, and so it is indeed, the whole world is like that a bit. But the values, what are known as the valores or the legacies of April, were three basically, and as was explained this morning by one of the commanders, which is liberdade, freedom, no to repression, and no to a dictatorship. That was why the April captains did what they did. Peace, so no wars, any kind of war, internal or external, and of course it was to end the colonialism in Africa. Portugal was the last colonial power after everybody had given pretty much their colonies, and justice, whatever you take for justice. Justice is in social end, justice is in justice, for victims, justice in all its forms. Those are the three so-called values of April, as literally translated, but I call them legacies of April. So thanks to all of you. We're going to talk a little bit about the community, take a bit of a time to introduce yourselves. I know all of you are known as certain parts of the community, but since we're doing this statewide, and we have been having folks and comments from people, and I appreciate that, in Hawaii, in Idaho, Texas, New York, Florida, and also last state was Arizona. So thank you all for joining us. We have folks who I know and respect in the Portuguese American community. Thank you so much. Of course, Linda, to Eric. We had a fascinating presentation from Eric here a couple of years ago. And also Rose, who I know since she was a child, I think since she was a baby. I know her father quite well, and I wish him all the health in the world, because he's a dear friend and a great person. And also Norbert. Norbert is, we can't see you, Norbert, but we can see the name. So hopefully we'll be able to see you. And I believe that both Norbert and Norberto, as we say in Portuguese, and Rose just both came back from the Azores, if I'm not mistaken, from the island of Terceira. I know Norbert came about 2 weeks ago, and I think you just returned about a week ago, Rose, correct?
I got back to San Jose Tuesday. So what is that? A few days ago, yeah.
You're, as we used to say, fresh off the boat.
I am fresh off the plane now. We do planes now. So fresh off the plane, yes, I am.
Okay. So we're going to take a few minutes, if you don't mind, 4 to 5 minutes each, if you don't mind doing that, and kind of giving a little bit of an intro about yourself. Tell us, of course, your connection to Portugal, your connection to the community as well. We'll start with Rose, since she's already spoken.
My name is Rose Martins. My connection to the community is my family is from Terceira. Specifically, both sides are from Quatro Ribeiras, the north side of the island. My dad immigrated to California 1975. So actually 1 year after 25 de Abril. And my mother was born here. And so I grew up in Tulare, California, which I think is a very big privilege to have such a good Portuguese American community there, specifically also a Azorean community there. As Denise said, that he knew my father, knew me from birth. So I think it's really awesome to experience the community. Even though I was born in America, I have had the privilege to have the direct connection. I'm fortunate to go back every single year, spend as much time as possible. This was a very quick 11-day trip. Last year, I was fortunate to have a month there. there before I was 3 months there. So I really respect and appreciate the Portuguese culture, community, and as well the progression that Portugal is making in lots of regards, in education and thought, also, women's liberties as well. So I currently live in San Jose, so another great area to have Portuguese community as well. Easy to be able to attend Dia do Portugal or go to an Earthquakes game on Portuguese Heritage Night. So, or go to Five Wounds Church and attend the festas. So I'm not as, I can't say that I'm part of like the Portuguese festas in those regards, but I do attend them, and I appreciate that lots of my peers continue to hold our heritage and values up. So I'm very proud to be Portuguese. If you know me, you know that I'm Portuguese, and going back to Terceira is really one of the most important things to me, because it's just the values of Portuguese people, values of Azorian people, and as well, I know we're going to get more into democracy and even the values of how 25 de Abril came to be, and the fact that there was not much bloodshed. And I think that is a good indicator of like the heart of Portuguese people, hardworking people, want to be able to live a peaceful life and be able to live an honest life.
Indeed, that's great, Rose. And Rose, you don't have to go to a festa to be Portuguese. There's more.
Okay, there is definitely more to
I can
that.
give you a long list of things that make a Portuguese person. And I know plenty of people, when people tell me, everybody in Terceira goes to bullfights, I say, no, they don't. And then we say, what do you mean they don't go to bullfights? Because sometimes there's 3 of them and there's like 3,000 people in each one. That's true. Do the math. That's 9,000. We have 57,000. So there's 49,000 not going to bullfights. So,
but that's a very good point. And I think that is one thing that I love about going back, because I'm just going to speak, this is not a fact, this is opinion. I've experienced that there's an opinion of what it is like there, but when I go there, it's very different. They progress. And yes, not everyone's going to bullfights, not everyone's going to festas, not everyone's eating bread.
Yeah. Fish
So
is an
yes.
important part of the identity here in the United States. Obviously, we know. I think none of us would question that. But if you don't go to it, you can still be Portuguese. So you can still be Portuguese, Rose. And you're
Thank
very.
you so much. I appreciate it. I will admit that I did go to a torada, because there was festas, the Porto Buscoach. It was amazing.
Yeah, those are fun.
Yes.
Eric, if you don't mind, the same thing, please.
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you, Denise, for inviting me to come on this. It's truly an honor, and I'm excited to be back. So my name's Eric Dutra. I'm 24 years old. I graduated from Whittier College 2.5 years ago. What I do for work, I work in this field when it comes to getting people out to vote and all that good stuff. So I'm really passionate about this issue. My connection to the community. My father's Portuguese. He's currently an elected council member of the city of Whittier. I've been a part of the Portuguese community since I was born. My family immigrated here in 1971. My dad first came, and then my vovô, who was looking to not go back to Guinea-Bissau, took him, my avó, and my tio to the States, where they have remained ever since. I've attended all the festas. I was a part of some of the courts, and I really wear my heritage on my sleeve. It's really important to know where you're going, and the only way you know where you're going is where you came from. So in 2021, I spent 6 months writing a piece on my grandfather, writing a historical piece, tying in his story to the overall history of colonialism in our community, and then tying it into the Carnation Revolution. And I look forward to chatting with everyone a little bit further about it.
Yeah, and it was a great piece. I read it. Congrats, Eric. And now Linda, Dr. Linda Carvalho-Cooley. Carvalho, I should say that. That's a short name of the three.
Yeah, if not, they're wondering why is she on this panel, right? So first, two things. First of all, I know everyone's going to think I'm a Porto fan because I've got all this blue in my picture, but I am a Benfica girl. So just want to say that up front. And I have to rebut Rose because I think bread is a requirement of Portuguese people. If not bread, wine, one of the two. I am Dr. Linda Carvalho-Cooley. I am a full-time professor at Reedley College teaching communication studies, which means I teach argumentation and debate, which is very political. I pride myself on the fact that I teach students how to do the process and how to think, not what to think, and guide them and play devil's advocate quite a bit with them. They never know what side I'm on. I also am a part-time instructor at a lecture at Fresno State University, which is my alma mater, and my program called and asked me to come back and teach. And I only teach upper division courses there, teaching upper division interpersonal communication and also upper division communication and learning classes for future teachers. So I know that my culture always comes into my classroom. It can't be helped. It's part of who I am. My father was born in Terceira, and he is from Ribeirinha, which a lot of people know that particular village. And maybe because we all like to talk a lot, I'm not sure. But he was born there in Santo Amar and immigrated to Canada first, along with his brother and sisters, and then ended up in California. He had a radio program for many, many years. A lot of people knew him. If you don't know him, your parents or your grandparents probably did. He also helped a lot of people become American citizens. I was able to help with teaching some of those classes. So that was a lot of fun to help people get their American citizenship. And just to kind of make that go full circle, I am also a dual citizen. I am a Portuguese citizen now. So not only did I help people become American citizens, I then became a Portuguese citizen. So that's pretty much it. So I'm excited about this panel.
Thank you for being here, Linda. Appreciate it. And Linda's also on our advisory board or on the executive board, I should say, for Bruma Publications. So just just to make sure that there's full transparency for anybody who might be saying that, yeah, we're partial to people who help PBBI. So last but certainly not least, our good friend Norbert Duarte. Welcome. Welcome from Terceira. I saw you.
Yes.
I saw you go on the plane.
Yeah, I think you were in first class and I was in stowage, so probably didn't get much interaction there.
But anyway.
No, thank you for having me again. And so again, my name is Norbert Duarte. I am currently living in Merced, but really been all around the valley. So predominantly lived a few years in the Visalia area, born in Los Banos. I am also a first generation Portuguese born here in the United States, as was most all of my cousins. My parents immigrated in 1974, literally 3 days after April 25th, the revolution. And they were the last to immigrate over here. My aunts and uncles had all come previously, and they all ended up together in Los Banos working for one farm at the time. I am a graduate of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. I currently work for Saladino's Food Service. We are a broadline foods distributor throughout the state of California. And, I'm very involved in the Portuguese community. Specifically, I still speak it. That's because how we were born and raised, very close to my culture. I was involved both on the committee as well as past president for the Pismo Beach St. Anthony celebration. And one of my ways of trying to keep a close tie, especially seeing that I'm starting to see disconnects with the next generation, as in my nephews, and hopefully I can change that as they grow up. But trying to keep as much of the ties as we can. And touching on visiting, yes, I just came back from Terceira. It was actually a way to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, and so made the trip. Took them there. It was very enjoyable. They claim it might be their last time. I don't know, but we treated it as it was. And for me, it was my 5th time visiting. And touching on what Rose was saying, each time I've gone, it's been some good progression. And even this last time had been 8 years since I last was, and already saw some significant changes, which is a positive, but still see the close-knit family ties and community of the islands. So we're from Terceira, the village of Sahita, and we were there for the Our Lady of Miracles celebration. And one interesting note is, of all in my family, every single person married within the same village. So there is not one person outside of our village. So when we go to Sahita, it's all of us. There's no disconnect there. So it's a nice thing, and nice thing to say. I still have family there. I still have my aunt, my godmother in Biscoch and Terceira, and then I have an uncle who splits his time between Biscoch and Terceira. Biscoch and Lisbon, and he's a former educator at the University of Lisbon. And interestingly enough, talking about revolution, he was a conscientious objector of Salazar back in the mid to late 70s, and I thought that was an interesting tie-in as well with what we'll be discussing today. So thank you for having me again, and I look forward to our discussion.
Sure. Yes, Luis Fagundes Duarte is a good friend and a great writer, by the way.
That's right.
And one of the specialists on Vitorino Nemesio and a couple other writers in Portugal who I've known for a very long time. But indeed, so let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, we will go around the same kind of order that we just did, and just to basically give me some thoughts that you might have, that you might have heard from your family. You're all very young, so you weren't around, but when the revolution happened, what are some of the thoughts? And I know Eric has a whole piece that he could read from on it, but what are some of the things that your family mentioned to you as you were growing up? Because most of you are a product of around the generation or after the revolution, but what are the things that you have heard about? Because it's something, unfortunately, and I do mean that word unfortunately, because we pride ourselves here in this country on being a democracy, and we are. The mother of modern day democracy is the United States of America. Yet we don't celebrate in the Portuguese community o 25 de Abril. We don't celebrate Portugal turning into a democracy after a dictatorship and a very brutal, well, it was brutal in a lot of ways, dictatorship, but also before the dictatorship, we were a republic for a very short period of time, had like 32 governments in 16 years. And before that, we were a monarchy. So to us, democracy is something very new. We tried it for a little while there, a bit in the 1910, but did not work very well. And so it's something very new. So any thoughts? I'll start with Rose. Rosie, any thoughts growing up in Tulare? Did anybody ever mention the revolution or what was going on in Portugal? And there were, and I know that all of you know this, but especially Eric, who studied it, but, it was a tough time, 1974, 75. We didn't know politically how Portugal was going to go. And they actually, on our first day, we had a very interesting talk by Dr. Daniela Melo, who talked about the Portuguese involvement in making sure that Portugal went in a democratic direction, including being received in the White House by 2 Portuguese Americans, and President Ford listened to them and followed their advice, which is quite interesting. We made it all the way to the White House to get Ford's ear. That's impressive, even at any time, even in George Washington's time. Rose, your thoughts? Have you ever heard of this revolution? I know you've heard, but I mean, as being raised in Tulare, family, friends, etc.
So being raised in Tulare and having lots of Portuguese friends and Portuguese American friends, I don't think we spoke about it growing up. My dad would speak about it though. So my dad grew up in Terceira until he came here in 75. So basically his whole time was under the authoritarian regime of Salazar and Catano. And so what he says is you can't talk, you could not trust people outside of the family and even in the family, because you just didn't know if somebody was going to report you. He would talk about, people would stay within their own freguesia because, again, they don't know who you are, if they can trust you, if you are a spy, or if you're going to turn in. So there was no freedom of speech. There was no freedom of sharing your opinions or even talking about anything going against the government or going against, what was going on. So I think that because of how he was raised, influenced a lot of how he is now, which is a very, being moderate, going with the time, and just letting people live their lives. I believe that I'm very fortunate that both of my parents are, a bit progressive in thought, as well as, letting other people live their own lives and not wanting to influence or hold other people's choices against them. So in regards to 25 de Abril, like I know I learned more about it growing up and being more curious about Portuguese culture and the history of Portugal, because there is just so much rich history. I wish, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation, because I hope this sparks more conversation to get our community to understand the importance of democracy and where we actually came from. Yeah.
Indeed. So some very good thoughts. Eric.
Yeah. So I did not hear about the revolution until high school. And it didn't occur to me why until just now. And Rose touched on it. My family didn't talk about it. My avô did not talk about the revolution. He talked about his time in Guinea. He talked about Timor and Mozambique. My dad was too young to understand what was really going on in the revolution. But the conversation first came up about the Carnation Revolution because I was writing a report on my dad, and I was asking him, why did you come to the States? I was a little bit older. I was a junior in high school by then, so I had an idea of the issues that were going on at the time. And he sat me down and talked about the revolution. That was the first I heard about it. For my grandfather, it actually took a while to get the conversation started. When I first started writing my piece, it took about a month and a half to really sit down with my grandpa for 5 or 6 hours to hear the story, to hear about one of the stories in what I wrote. My grandfather, when he was in Guinea, one of his lieutenants came up to him and was talking about a revolution and about the army overthrowing Salazar. And he quieted down very quickly. He sent my avó away while they were having that conversation, because he knew that, that's against the law. We can't be talking against the government. And my grandfather, in his nature, is a loyal person. He signed up for the army because he believed in something. And as he saw the effects of colonialism, as he spent a couple of tours in Guinea, he started to realize that it wasn't good. And that's really what led to him coming here. Long answer to a short question. I didn't hear about until, from my grandfather, really getting a full history of it until April of 2021.
Thank you, Eric. And Linda, your thoughts.
So am I the token older person in the group? So I would love to say that I wasn't born, present company excluded with Denise. I would love to say that I wasn't born yet when it happened, but I was, and but I was young. I was very, very young. Can I say that? Children weren't talked to about this type of thing. I wish I had recordings of my dad's radio program, because I know that he talked about it, but it would have been after the fact. I do remember being in the airport, because we went every year. So I do remember this one moment of being in the airport and all of us taking like a big group picture in the airport, and the tropa coming and wanting to confiscate the cameras. it was bizarre. It was like unusual behavior. So I remember it just really standing out in my mind. And my dad and my uncle kind of dealt with it, and they wanted to take the camera. And we were just taking a group picture because we had all arrived, but it wasn't, they didn't want photos of where people were based or what was going on, apparently. My dad explained it very simplistically to us, and we went about our business. I agree with Eric. There was a lot of suspicion about who might say something about someone talking about it. And I remember it was very hushed, and children were not allowed as part of that conversation. And I know that my uncles and my dad would talk, but really didn't understand the significance until much, much later on. Also, we tend to, and I wish, Denise, that you would do a lecture on this and like record it for all of us to watch a real good history of it. But I think we have this vision of April, Abril, that it was magically over, and it wasn't magically over. I mean, it continued. I know it continued all through the summer, and I think till the end of the year. It might have even continued for another year, but there was still some stuff and protests going on. So it wasn't, we tend to look back on history and kind of see sort of an idyllic look at how it occurred, you know, with the carnations. It's great, you know, that's a great story, but it didn't end there. There was still a lot of protests that happened beyond that. So it would be nice to know and honor that history better, but not just from people's conversations or what they think about the story, but to make sure that it was the actual true story of what happened, getting different opinions. But that's what I know about it.
Indeed, and I'll address that point there in a little while. But Norbert, your thoughts as growing up in a Portuguese home, and of course, you know, in a Portuguese home with because I know your family and you have various political views. You know, I know Luis' political views very, very well. I know George's political views very, very well. So and I like both of them, and I get along with both of them very, very well. However, so how did the 25 de Abril ever pop up? Especially because, as you mentioned, you know, Luis was very involved.
Yeah, so to your point, our family is very divided, specifically on my father's side, which is where my uncle's from. So, you know, you have my aunt and my uncle on one side, my dad and my other uncle on the opposite side, very strong Buddhist beliefs. But growing up, obviously, I was born 1 year after the revolution, and my parents came a few days after the fact. And really, the only discussion that was ever done was more in talking of what the repercussions were if you didn't do a certain thing. You know, if you didn't write with your right hand instead of your left, you know, what would happen? If you spoke of someone or the government in a negative way, what could or couldn't happen? Things to that point. Even to this day, even our most recent trip, here's my father saying, "No tempo Salazar, no tempo Salazar." Basically, you know, when Salazar was in, this is how things were done. And he even alluded to some things that he missed. You know, like when Salazar was in charge, we did this. There was never a thought of doing that. I don't have specific examples, but that still comes up. And so that was the extent of the conversations in our household. And I was a young adult when I finally understood the 25th of April. And that was only because I had a trip to Lisbon as part of my high school graduation. And then there was that discussion, and I was spending time with my tio Luis, who obviously, you know, filled me in on a lot of different things. But it's funny, he never spoken to me about his involvement in being in the opposition. That came through my mother because something happened. Someone in the village leaked some information where my grandmother called my mother at the time, says, "Help me get rid of these books that Luis has. He can't have these anymore." And my mom always said it was books that she just said it was like the devil, which don't know if that's the right example, but to her, it was evil books based on how she was being taught in school and how they were being raised, same with my father, etc. So yeah, that's the extent of it. Other than, again, that's the regime, that's how it was. And God forbid if you went against the grain, if you would. And then talking about political sides, you know, my parents and my uncles and aunts were raised in that regime, but yet half of my family seems to kind of lean into those thoughts again in today's climate, which is interesting to say, but, you know, we all have our rights to believe, I guess. So,
Sure.
but yeah, that was our extent.
Indeed, indeed, and some good points there, Norbert. And you were right. And your parents and your uncles and aunts were absolutely right. I mean, I was in Portugal until I was the age of 10. I'm around Luisa's age, and he's a couple of years older than I am, but not much. And I mean, I had this poor young man next to me who I tried to reconnect actually when I was back there, but I didn't have enough time. I can't count how many times that poor kid was hit on the hand with a ruler because he was left-handed.
Right.
And that was not right. He was being stupid and dumb, and he wasn't thinking straight, and he was not going to be a good person because he wrote with his left hand, and he actually wrote very well. Had better calligraphy than mine. And just add a couple, 2 points to everyone else. So as Rose said, you stayed within the freguesia because you never knew who was going to say something, who was going to be whatever. My father was a very open-minded man, not a learned man, didn't go to school. I mean, well, yeah, the 4th grade, but did not go to past that. But my dad, who knew Rose's dad really well and were friends, my dad loved the carnaval, which is the terceira style carnaval dancing, and was part of it in his young age. And he told me this story that I think is just, creativity at the most of the Zorians, which is they did 2 assuntos, 2 different ones, and they would go from freguesia to freguesia to play in the dança, and they would ask around, you think there's anybody here from Pete? Pete was the secret police. And they said, nah, not here, there's anybody. So they would do the one that was critical of Salazar. When they'd go to another one, they would ask them, say, hey, you be careful because there's a couple of people here we don't know much. So they would do the one that was, giving all of the different accolades to Salazar. I mean, it's not easy remembering un assunto, for a dança. Imagine having to have 2 in your mind because you never know which one you're going to. And lastly, to add to Linda and her dad, famous radio man, Antonio Carvalho, Antonio e Elvira, the couple, Carvalho, Lucianoia. We just talked about that. Lucia was a Portuguese radio DJ here, like Linda's father and myself when I was younger. And Lucia was against the regime. Lucia had been in high school, had been pinned because she made a comment about the regime. And the person next to her father was a Pete agent. So she almost ended up in jail. That's why she left and came to Canada, like Antonio Carvalho first and then here. And Lucia was very happy. She was telling me about this as I was doing some research on some community members when the 25 de Abril happened. So 2 months later, in June, she changed the name of her radio program. It used to be called O Sol de Portugal, Portuguese Sun, and she changed it to Portugal Novo. So after that, she had to go to every single sponsor because people in the community, and this leads up to my next question, people in the community accused her of being a communist, because if she was not a communist, she would not have changed the name of the program to the New Portugal. So, and she said, I was lucky because I did not lose one single sponsor, but I had to go to 35 different businesses and explain to them that, and if you know Lucianoia today, she's everything, she's the opposite of the communist as far as, but it was the easy target, at the time. And it was, so leads me to the question. Let's bring 25 de Abril to our community, or the values of it. And how do you see our Portuguese American community? You're all involved in one way or another, or someone who is, or you at Festa Committee as Norbert has been. I have friends on both sides of the so-called political aisles, and we, as with my good friend George Duarte, we don't talk politics, but we still talk very well, and we have a lot of fun together. But we just don't. We avoid that, and so how do we talk to each other if we disagree on partisan politics? First of all, it's because it's unfortunately hitting our community. I've seen people here in Tulare that are not friends with each other any longer because of partisan politics. That saddens me. Some people are afraid of saying their political affiliation because they want to be branded one way or another. It doesn't make any difference, one way or another. So how do we have a healthy conversation in the Portuguese American community amongst ourselves, understanding that we can and I'm going to start with Linda because she does this for a living and at a university level. How do we have this? How do we have the debate of ideas without insults, obviously, and how do we and do you feel that there may be sometimes a lack of democracy within our organizations in our community? And that may be a separate question, but how do you feel about these issues, and do they affect our community here? So can we have a debate of ideas, sometimes outside of party politics, obviously, but that are aligned with how we look at different things in life? So I'll start with Linda. What do you think about the Portuguese American community? We're not very political, but yet we are now. I mean, because we do have Portuguese Americans in Congress, and that's great. And we have them from both parties, and we've always had them from both parties from the Central Valley. So, but it seems like now there's more of a divide.
There's a huge divide. I used to do political consultations, and I had no problem crossing the aisle and working for party for either candidate on either side of the aisle. I no longer do speech writing, debate training, none of that anymore for political candidates because they're so divisive. I think that it's a shame that we don't reward those that cross the aisle rather than elevating the rhetoric of people who are incredibly on one side or the other. That seems to be the voice that we keep hearing and sharing, instead of focusing on those that are willing to come to the center and create policies and problem solve, which is what we were founded on, was the idea. I think whenever you have just and I know we have more than two parties, but when you have two major parties that are so polar opposites, and they never used to be, I mean, they've crossed back and forth between conservative and liberal, which side they were, but I think that they have, generally speaking, in my lifetime, when a candidate wanted to run for office, they moved to the center to gather votes. And so they would both move to the center. And what we're seeing now is that they're moving to the fringe rather than coming together. And I think that that's a problem. That's a huge problem. And the biggest issue we have in the Portuguese American community, and I would say not just in the Portuguese American community, but in America in general, is that we've gotten to where we label people. And once they're labeled, they are put into a category where they're a bit dehumanized. They're categorized, and it's like, well, all of whatever political party it is, they all believe this, they all think this. And what I do in my class is I make them find stories. I send them to something called All Sides or Balanced News, so that they can read the same news story from the left, from the right, and from the center, so they can see how media tends to kind of play up or play down a particular element of a story. And by challenging them to read it from the different versions, then talk about, well, how come those versions are being, in argumentation, I always teach that whenever we elevate something, that means we're suppressing something else. So anytime you elevate, something else is being suppressed. And so we really kind of break all of those stories up so that we can have those discussions. I just want to point out one thing. I show old videos of debates, presidential debates, in my class. And a few years ago, well, more than that now, 8 years ago or so, I showed a video of, actually, it was John F. Kennedy, and it's the Great Debates. We call them the Great Debates, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And I showed that debate, and I asked the students, I go, what do you see in this video? What stands out to you that seems different? And the reoccurring comment was how polite they were to each other. And I thought, but it was true. And I'm glad that they could see it. And we talked about the civility, and presidential debates are not, they're not true debates. They're made for TV. They follow a modified format of various different types of debate. But they become more spectacle than they have been. If anybody watching or on the panel has ever done a debate, debates are timed, they're respectful, they're on topic. And that's not what we're seeing, unfortunately. Now students are watching these debates and thinking that that's what debate is, and it's not. So usually I have to retrain them the minute they walk in my class going, that's not what we're going to do in here. We're going to do it this way. And an academic debate is more reasoned discussion. Those rules are not applied everywhere. And in friendships, I have friends on both sides of the aisle as well. And it's gotten to where you can't have those kinds of discussions, which is really sad. Because I think that most of us are not on the edge. We're probably more in the middle. And I think that we're all being ignored in light of the spectacle on the fringe. So
we may have to do what a friend of mine said in the first debates that we had, the first panel. He said that for the 25 de Abril, he always seems to be, he's retired educator, Eduardo Eusébio, and he said he spends most of his time now in that particular time of the year in Portugal. And so for the 25 de Abril, the way they celebrate it is they have a lunch with one person from each of the political party that's friends, all the way from Chega, which is a very ultra-right, very, very, to many people dangerous party, all the way to the Portuguese Communist Party. And they said there's like usually about 15 of them, one or two from each different political parties, and they have this great lunch and they discuss and they yell at each other, and then they have some good Portuguese wine, and they're all friends, and that's actually the true spirit of April. So I told them that we got, our challenge is maybe to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Abril this coming April. We should do that, getting Republicans and Democrats, very conservative, very liberal, everybody, one from each, and have a dinner and to see if we can have enjoy the wine and the conversation and yell at each other without hitting each other. I don't want to do it at Fresno State; it might be violent. So Norbert, your thoughts on all these issues, including democratic principles from your perspective, and you've seen a lot of things, of course, in the Portuguese American community because you've been involved in organizations, and they're part of who we are.
Yeah, and it's a lot of these things I bring up is how I witnessed it growing up. So the very first election that I remember, or at least that in my own memory, was between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. And my father, people we knew, and this isn't based on a fact, based on what I saw, were very democratic. And they always used the term that Republicans are for the rich, that didn't benefit them. Now, going back, I grew up in communities that were small, Newman, Gustine, Turlock, Merced, very rural, very much farming life, very much working in the factories, what have you. So there's very strong democratic values where it seems as we've grown, for whatever reasons, that has shifted, where now they're part of the rich party, if that's how they wanted to define it. My own dad included. I remember he voted Democratic for how many administrations, then all of a sudden he became a staunch Republican. So be it. Same with my uncles, frankly, except my uncle Luigi. But we're in a time, and we touched on with my uncle George, him and I, we cannot talk politics. We will fight. And the thing is, I'm not a fighter. And frankly, along party lines, I'm very much in the middle. I am fiscally conservative, yet socially liberal. And some may say you can't, you gotta be one or the other. But then to Linda's point, there's a time we would agree to disagree. The debates you're talking about, I remember it was very, gentlemanlike, if you would, because predominantly it was, men that were debating up until the last few years, but it was respectful. There was handshakes, there was respect for the comments being said, the discussions, and then they walked away without gunshots or what have you. But that's not the case, and not just with politicians, but with people in general. I'm involved in the organizations where the Republican mindset outweighs the Democratic. And not saying that's right or wrong, but it always seems it has to be something like it's my way or no way. There's no meeting in the middle. There's no just discussion. And in my own household, if we're going to talk politics, I ask that it be respect, or we don't discuss it at all at my table. Because if not, we're just going to hate each other, or we're going to have some ill feelings. And it's really sad, especially when we look at generations like my father, my uncles, and others in there who were the Tim Salazar. And that's what they were told. Like, they wanted to be basically, I don't say they wanted to, but basically they were repressed, and that's what they knew. They knew no different. And yet they came to this country to somewhat escape that for a better life. But then it seems like in some cases they want that firm hand. I don't know if that makes much sense, but that's kind of what I see. And then here I am also too. I'm a member of the LGBT community. So that throws people in for a ringer when they want to say a certain statement. And they look at me like, oh, that can affect you. Yeah, it can. And now I'm not saying everything, it's all one way or another again, but there's going to be some discussions, but it sometimes can throw some folks into a ringer. Our last trip to SETA, there's my dad, the staunch Republican, and my uncle Luis, the very much liberal, and they don't talk now. It'll last for a few weeks and they'll make it back again, but it's very firm one way or another. And I just see it in our community, and it's unfortunate, I think. I also think too is, the very beginnings, if you saw a negative commercial about a politician, that was the extent of it. Now with so much social media and discussions and different ways of meeting and talking and sound bites, I think it makes it worse. And again, based on what I see, I'm not a politician and I never want to be one, but it's definitely not the same as it was 20, 30 years ago.
But maybe you should be. Because we need more people that consider these both sides. I must say, Norbert, that I got one very, very nice compliment from my good friend George the other day. I was at a Portuguese event, and he introduced me to someone, and he says, "I'm sure you know Denise Borges. She writes for the Portuguese newspaper." And I said, "Yes." And George does not like anything I write. And he says, and he answered this perfectly, though. I have to say, I was very proud of him. He said, no. You write very well. I just don't agree with your ideas. And so that was about the best.
Not a lie.
George. But anyway, indeed it is. And especially because we do have to work with each other in the community, in our social halls, in our activities, that that people should be able to discuss. I mean, it's too bad we can't, after a presidential debate, like Linda said, when they become, not the same political party, but of different political parties, that we cannot probably go to the Portuguese hall that afternoon or that evening or the next day to a meeting and discuss, what we agree, what we don't disagree, and without, basically, as you said, doing this and yelling at each other. Rose, your thoughts on community, the values of April and the Portuguese community and democracy and freedom of speech and all of the good things that we sometimes take for granted.
I do want to say, after a political debate, you may not be able to go to the Portuguese hall, but also after a big win or a loss of a certain club, you also might want to stay home, depending on which club you like.
That's true.
But I agree. It saddens me that our community, and I'm more from the Tulare community, that we're not able to have good discourse without it turning personal or just getting out of hand. I agree with Norbert that, I see it as well as like most of us are here because we were escaping lots of the things. And then to just continue it, it's confusing for me. I don't know if it comes from not necessarily knowing the history or not speaking about the history, but we know that democracy is best for all people, in my opinion, and I think kind of shown throughout world history. So, the liberties and freedoms for all people to share their ideas, to share their opinion in a respectful manner, I think, unfortunately, is not celebrated as well. I consider myself a moderate person. Some people consider me a very liberal person, but it just it just depends on who you're speaking to. But I consider myself a moderate person, and I just like to get along with people and share discussions, because I don't know everything, unfortunately. So I would like to see our community to be able to, even at a Portuguese Fest or anything, to be able to get together, have civil conversation, civil discourse, and share ideas, and know that, we have to work together if we're going to make progress and make things better.
Indeed, and we're very mainstream community nowadays. It's no longer the same community that it was, 40 or 50 years ago. People vote, and people are very mainstreamed, but there are some things that are typical to the Portuguese, that are very dear to the Portuguese community, and some things that may be under attack. When I mean I'm under attack, I don't mean under attack, literally in that aspect, but there are some issues, for example, the teaching of the Portuguese language in schools. Issue unify Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't make any difference. If you want that tradition to continue, if you want your children and other children to have access to this language, it should unify us. But sometimes it doesn't. And I've had this debate because of that. Bullfights, for example, whether you like them or not, they're authorized in California, but they can be disauthorized tomorrow morning, one never
Yes.
knows. And so you need to have a unifying voice
Exactly.
between both political parties if you think that this is a tradition that's important to continue, in the future. So there are some things that we kind of need to unify. I agree with you, Rose. And it's just, sometimes people say, well, but I'm not going to listen to you because you're of that party or of that party, or even worse. And this has happened to me when I've started teaching. I made a comment in one of my classrooms, and that's of course a nasty thing to do. And I was accused of being a communist. I mean, if I was a member of the Communist Party, I would tell you I am, but I'm not. But it's just, but that is exactly what people would say, and I know exactly what's also what Norbert's saying, about the LGBTQ community. It's the same thing. We kind of have this in our community, that if you're not of this, if you don't agree with me, you're a communist. If you don't agree with this, and your sexual orientation is different, you're whatever. So, and I understood that for my father's generation, the people who are 90 plus, but not for your generation, or even mine, or all of yours, and you're from multiple generations. Eric, the historian, put some perspective in this, please.
Well, this is a very interesting topic, and I've faced it my entire life. My father was elected when I was 12 years old. And he was one of the few Portuguese elected down here in Southern California. So I have three different kind of identities that I've gone through ever since that's happened. The first one was being the son of an elected. And anytime you're an elected official, whether it's a nonpartisan seat like a city council or a president, people are always going to ask the first question, what's your party? And I vividly remember I was and like everyone that said, I'm a moderate guy. I'm a lot the same as a lot of folks in my generation. I was driving with my dad when I was 13, 14 years old. I just got into high school, and I was starting to, think about politics, and, it was a field that maybe I want to go into. And I said something that ticked him off, and it was probably my young ignorance. And he pulled the car over, and he said, political views, politics is like driving. It is a team effort. Everyone has to work together to make sure everyone's safe. And if you go too far right, what happens? And I said, oh, you end up in the gutter. And then my dad said, right. And what happens if you go too far left? And he said, you end up in the gutter. And he said that is the best place where majority of the people in this world are going to be placed at. So that was my first encounter with politics, was that analogy that my father gave. Move into college. I like I said in my bio, I work in politics. Full time. I run campaigns down here in Orange County. And when I got in college, that's when I really first started my political journey. And I wear it on my sleeve. I'm more of a moderate conservative. I'm one of the only people that my friends know that is a conservative, because most people are moderate left. And I thought that was interesting. And going back to one of the big themes of the revolution of freedom of speech, During COVID and before COVID, my parents are really grateful for my parents. They would let me host events at my house, at our house. And I would get people from as far left as you can go and people further right than me. And usually it was over a bottle of wine or a bottle of whiskey, but we would just sit for 5, 6, 7 hours on a Saturday and we would talk politics. We talk political theory. We wouldn't go into Republican, Democrat. We wouldn't go into that stuff. We would go more issue based and we would just find ways where we could compromise. And one of my best friends is actually a self-proclaimed communist. And we would spend 6 hours talking together about why does he believe what he believes? Why do I believe what I believe? And through those conversations, we were able to find places where, hey, I don't agree with how you're getting there, but the principle I agree with. And in order to promote democracy and in order to promote civil conversations and bring that civility back, especially in the Gen Z era, where a lot of people my age, their first interaction with politics was not a friendly type of politics. It was a very aggressive, not policy driven. It was more of a show and like a team competition, red team versus blue team, who wins. It starts with the conversations, and it starts with being able to not admit, but have the trust in yourself to know that you don't know everything and to be open to having those conversations, especially in a long formed way where you're talking 5, 6, 7 hours. And then in the community, there are 2,000 members of the Portuguese community in the district that I work in down here in Artesia, and only 1,000 Portuguese voted. And that's something that hits home to me, because I'd love to see 80, 90% of our community voting. So one of the big focuses that I have began to work on in these last couple of years, and in this last 6 months really, is engaging in the community and inviting those conversations to happen, bringing Portuguese elected officials to the fold and representing our community in the most positive way possible. So yeah.
Indeed, and that we could have a whole other discussion on the Portuguese voting, and although in certain parts, for example, in Turlock, they've done a real good job, and the Portuguese community votes quite a bit, whether one agrees or disagrees how the Portuguese community votes, but they are one of the biggest, the ethnic communities in the Turlock area, and that gets involved, and indeed we kind of need to look at that aspect as well, because that's one of our issues. We don't have enough Americans of Portuguese background in political power, and as a good friend of mine likes to say, if you don't have a seat at the table, chances are you're going to be on the menu. So if we don't want to be on the menu, we better get a seat at the table. And that's basically we're just about out of time, but I want to thank all of you. If you have anything to add, please do that. We still have a couple of minutes. I want to thank all of you. I think it's an enlightening discussion. I think that we kind of all agreed that we should disagree, but should do it civilly and with some civility, and we at the same time kind of unite around some Portuguese issues. I think that when I mean Portuguese issues, there are issues that are human issues, whether they be issues of freedom and of peace and of justice. Those are all human issues, and that's why the revolution occurred. But as Dr. Linda Carvalho-Kulu said, and she's right, I mean, there was a very tough time in 1974 and 75. There was some beautiful time. The revolution is a very romantic revolution, because nobody died. Technically, one person did, but revolutions are usually about and I can tell you that a friend of mine, for example, was a Portuguese friend who was very good friends with Luís Fagundes Duarte, was a poet who passed away a few years ago in the island of Terceira, and he said, and he had been a victim of the Salazar and Catano regimes. He was an elementary teacher. He read things that were prohibited. James Baldwin was prohibited. Some of the great African American writers were prohibited in the Azores. How did he read them? He read English. But how did he read them? The librarian at the U.S. Air Force Base that he got to know as a friend, and she would slip these books to him because they were available at the base. Americans could read whatever they wanted to, but nobody else could. But he read all these all these voices in America that were not authorized. John Steinbeck wasn't authorized, and the only book that shouldn't be authorized in Portugal is the one he talks bad about the Portuguese. But other than that, they should all be authorized. But and now they are. So when the revolution happened, his sister was in Lisbon, just in the story, and she called him. And she said, that we have a revolution. There are tanks on the street. She goes, what? I mean, he's in Angra. There's no street and there's no tanks on the street. And what happened basically was that he turned on, the radio. This is 1974. There was no television in the Azores other than the U.S. Air Force Base. And so he turned,
I watched Heidi on TV in Dutch with Portuguese subtitles in 1973. And it was only at the hotel. They had one small screen.
But
So but in the homes, no.
Yeah, they funneled in what we would call today, they called it then closed circuit TV.
Closed circuit TV, yes.
But there was no television station in the Azores until 1976. And so anyway, he went to listen to the radio, and they were playing military marches, those bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, that kind of stuff. And he said, oh no, he called his friends and he said, this thing is going the wrong direction, because usually military marches is a military junta. It's the opposing Salazar to have another dictatorship, but only one by the military. Yeah, and until he heard the speech made by the MFA, the Movimento das Forças Armadas, he said, we were scared to death. Until they came on and started talking for about 4 or 5 hours, we were scared to death, because it was all these military marches. And we said, this is not going, this is the opposite. This is going backwards, And so there was a lot of tough time there in Portugal during the 1974, 1975. He actually became the first mayor of Angra because nobody else wanted to be mayor, what was called a temporary mayor. And he would not take his salary. He would only take the salary of a teacher. The mayor made double what a teacher made. And they came to do the little, to oversee some of the expenses. And they said, what's with the salary? He's only taking half of what he's supposed to take. And he said, well, he's taking his salary as a teacher. He's not teaching, he's running the city. And he goes, but he has the right to double this. And she goes, and one lady said, he's a poet. Oh, okay. Well, I understand those people. He's a poet. He doesn't care about money. But so there was a lot of utopian things, someone going to be a mayor of a town and only taking the teacher's salary, the betterment of society, etc. However, there was also some nasty things as well. And it's just the way it went. But anyway, thank you all so much. I think we do need to learn more and more about the revolution, all of us, myself included. And I think in the Portuguese community, maybe we'll take Dr. Linda Cooley's advice and start talking a little bit more about this in historical terms. And we'll call on Eric to help out. Thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate your participation. I always appreciate all of you taking the time from your busy lives. Thanks for all you do directly and indirectly in the Portuguese American community. Because just to add to Rosa's point, I may not go to all the festas, I may not do all of this. I think what people do every day in their life, I think, what Linda does, bringing the Portuguese to her classroom, the stories, I think what Norbert does, through the business, talking about the Portuguese. I think that's the way that the community is going to grow. It's not just in the festa once a year that makes you Portuguese if you don't do all the other stuffs on a daily basis in your life and with your friends and your family and your acquaintances. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Appreciate it very, very much. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to disconnect all of these wonderful panelists from the last one, which was, of course, as you heard, the talking about democracy, talking about freedom in the Portuguese American community. We're going to continue, and we're going to bring in our next panelist as we continue here on the 47th Annual Luso-American Education Foundation conference. The conference, of course, put forth by PBBI, that's the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute from California State University, Fresno. So thank you so much. Continue with us, please.